Yapalingana, good evening and welcome to Time for Truth-Telling in Lutruwita, the 2022 Japanangka Errol West lecture, memorial lecture, brought to you as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. My name is Greg Lehman. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Aboriginal Leadership here at the University of Tasmania and a proud graduate of the university who started his undergraduate degree back in 1980. A few housekeeping notes, please, before we begin. Tonight we're broadcasting across First Nations lands in Australia and the world. But for those of you who are in the room with us tonight, please take a moment to switch off your mobile phones or switch them onto silent to avoid any disruption to this evening's proceedings. In the event of an emergency, please follow our event staff to your nearest exit and meet on the lawn between Churchill Avenue and Dobson Road, just out the front of the building. Bathrooms are located out in the corridor to the left of the entrance as you came in and also down the stairs. For our online viewers and listeners, please note that your microphone, camera, chat and raised hand functions have all been disabled to protect your privacy. We do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type your questions anonymously or identify yourself if you wish. We will address as many questions as possible from both our online and our in-room audiences in a Q&A session at the conclusion of the lecture. Finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels, and we'll supply details at the end of the session. I'd now like to invite Rob Anders to offer a welcome to country.
I'm Rob Anders, a direct descendant of Malagena, his daughter Warridiana. My people are the Trawaway and Parabini people from Tebrakuna country in the far northeast of the island. You may know it as Cape Portland or the Little Muscle Row area. It is a privilege to be invited to conduct this ceremony on this special occasion, the Japanangka Errol West lecture. I'd like to begin by questioning what a welcome to country is. For me, it's a ceremony that takes place when entering country. It is where old relationships are re-established and new relationships are formed. It is learning law and being granted permission to enter country, the law of where you can go and where you can't go, what you can do and what you can't do. I acknowledge and recognise lands that we gather on this evening here is clan country of the Muwinina people, country where I was born and care for. I pay my respects to and acknowledge their peoples as the original owners and custodians of these lands and waters. These rights have never been ceded. Their land is dominated by an almighty spirit mountain that rises above us alongside a great river system. They each have multiple names, but I call them the river, the mountain, on this island place that we all call home. They, like many of our peoples, bore the full force and brunt of colonisation. Sadly, while none of our Muwinina are believed to have survived, I live in hope that somehow they did survive and are on a journey back to us. In welcoming you, I always consider what our old people up in Sky Country would think of me undertaking this ceremony on their country. What did those old people think when those small islands appeared on the horizon to the south? Islands with trees that had no leaves, surrounded by white clouds that followed the islands as they slowly drifted up the river, with the lies and terrors they brought, and impacts that continue to this day. The story of our peoples is one of resilience and determination. Our peoples lived through and survived 2 ice age periods, times when sea levels fell some 120 metres before rising to present day levels about 10,000 years ago. As part of the world's oldest living culture, we have come back from the brink of extinction to reclaim our place. My ancestors learned to live with this country and learned how to care and how to look after it. They walked over the lands, treading lightly, leaving only footprints and the legacy for future generations. They were peaceful people who, with high ethical morals, who welcomed visitors. But sadly, their token of friendship was taken advantage of as their kindness was betrayed. The spirit in which I welcome you to country comes back to law, which focuses on honesty, truth, justice, integrity, and respect. Tonight's Japanangka Errol West lecture, titled Time for Truth-Telling in Lutruwita, speaks to these values. I look forward to hearing about how truth-telling and working towards treaty can create a brighter future for us all, one where Tasmanian and other Aboriginal peoples are rightfully acknowledged and respected on this silent place that we all call home. Finally, I'd like to recognise the many Aboriginal people who are joining with us here this evening and online, and of course my family members, Maggie and Greg. I would also especially like to acknowledge and welcome Japanangka's family who are joining us here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. The Island of Ideas series began in 2020 as a way of connecting our community and ideas while we were unable to host face-to-face events. The online program continues in the hope that we can connect Tasmania's community and research to people across regions and into a global network of ideas and emerging issues. Each year, the university presents hundreds of lectures, forums, seminars and workshops to nourish the ongoing learning of students, alumni and the wider public. These conversations are an important part of the university's role: connection, collegiality and community, which date back to our founding in 1890 and continue to be at the heart of our values today. The first Japanangka Errol West Memorial Lecture was held in 2015, I think, so it predates Island of Ideas. This annual event honours the life and work of Errol, an internationally recognised Tasmanian Aboriginal poet and scholar who I had the privilege of knowing back around the time that the Centre for Aboriginal Research and Education was established at the Tasmanian State Institute of Technology in Launceston around 1989. CARE, as it was known, was the forerunner of what we have today in the form of the university's Riawana Centre for Aboriginal Education that was established when the TSIT amalgamated with the university. So we have a very strong and very valuable legacy right here in this university. I'd like to extend a special welcome to some guests who have travelled a long way to be with us this evening. Members of Errol's family, Penina West, Niari West Frazier and Rihanna West. Thank you very much for travelling and joining us this evening. We also have apologies from Gillian West, Danny West and Joshua, who unfortunately, despite their best intentions, weren't able to make it tonight. Japanangka Errol West was a leading Tasmanian Aboriginal academic known for his scholarship in the field of Indigenous methodologies and pedagogies. Errol was an advocate for Indigenous rights and a compelling national leader across Indigenous higher education, and that leadership extended internationally. Errol was known for his strength and conviction and was referred to as an intellectual warrior. He was also a man who was prepared to confront institutional and societal prejudices in the interest of restorative justice and recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty. Errol served in senior positions within the National Aboriginal Education Committee and lectured at James Cook University, the Australian National University and Southern Cross University, where he worked until his passing. It is this legacy of alternative narratives and generosity of scholarship that this annual lecture seeks to represent. Tonight, we will hear from another intellectual warrior. Maggie Walter is Palawa, descended from the Parabina people of northeastern Tasmania, and a member of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Briggs family. She is an distinguished professor of sociology here at the University of Tasmania and a past Pro-Vice Chancellor, Aboriginal Research and Leadership. Her research focuses on race relations, inequity, research methods and methodologies. Maggie's published 6 books and more than 100 research articles and chapters relating to social policy, Indigenous equality, and more recently, Indigenous data sovereignty. Professor Walter is passionate about improving the position of Aboriginal people in Australian society and changing the dynamics around race relations. In May 2021, Maggie was appointed a commissioner with the Victorian Yoorrook Justice Commission, Australia's first and to date only truth-telling inquiry into the systematic injustice experienced by First Nations since colonisation. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Maggie Walter, to deliver Time for Truth-Telling in Lutruwita.
Japanangka, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. Let me introduce myself. So, Mina Maggie Walter, Mina Palawa Briggs, Parabina Lutruwita, Wizi Waranti, Kani Mapli Milathina. Mina Tunapri, Muhanina, Nigimpi Nagampi Takara, Mukaminya, Milathina, Nika, Warankili, Muka, Ngampi, Palawa, Tunapri, Ningimpi, Nagampi, Mana, Mapli. So my name is Maggie Walter. I'm Palawa. I'm a member of the Briggs Aboriginal family from Parabina country in Lutruwita, Tasmania. I acknowledge that we're meeting here on Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to the Muhanina people, the owners of this country, its skies and its waterways. And I pay my respects to Palawa elders past, present and emerging. So that's Parabina country right up there in the northeast. So pay attention, it's going to be important later. This, of course, also is my family line. So Manalagena at the top, my great-grandmother, Dalrymple Gower, and my father, Cecil Smith. Unfortunately, our family has no photos of Watiena, one of Manalagena's daughter, our Aboriginal ancestor, or her daughter, Dalrymple Briggs. But in June 2017, more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates met at Uluṟu. Now, I was very honoured to be a member of the Tasmanian contingent. There are other members here today. Actually, if you look above the F in from, you can see my signature up at the top. So the outcome of that meeting was an open letter to non-Indigenous Australia, the Uluṟu Statement from the Heart. This statement is essentially the same request made since colonisation began. It pronounces our unbroken possession of the Australian continent, even as it articulates our ongoing sense of powerlessness at the embedded inequality of our peoples. And like the many before it, the statement also proposes a way forward, calling for a makarata to oversee the development of a fair, just and truthful relationship between this continent's first peoples and those who arrived during and after colonisation. Or in the shorthand version, the Uluṟu Statement calls for truth, treaty and voice. So these 3 elements for how a new, more equitable relationship might be forged are distinctive but interlinked. There can be no valid voice without treaty. There can be no treaty without truth. And while the Uluṟu Statement sets a national ambition, colonisation historically and contemporaneously is place-bound. Lutruwita must do its own truth-telling. So let's talk truth. You might have noticed that when I acknowledged the Muhanina as the owners of this land, and as my fellow Briggs family member said, I paid my respects then to the Palawa peoples. As Rob said, as far as we know, there are no Muhanina who survived colonisation. That is the truth. As far as I can tell, all died before the mid-1820s. Yet I regularly hear acknowledgements here that pay respects to Muhanina elders present and emerging. This is done with good intent People just don't know. So let me say another truth. The founding reality of the Tasmanian state, is colonisation. I don't say this to be controversial. Again, it's a straightforward fact. But the fact that I need to add that rider is telling. British colonisation of this place was deliberate, formally sanctioned and purposeful. Again, a truth. Now, I want to stop there for a second and just talk about the word colonisation. It tends to be a bit of a red button word. It seems to trigger negative and painful emotions for many non-Indigenous people. I've observed that when that happens, often there are attempts to try and shut down the conversation. But truth-telling requires us to be much braver than that. So essentially, colonisation is when one group of people set up a colony in land belonging to another group with the intention of taking possession of those lands. Colonisation is all about the land, and that's what happened here. Or, in the perceptive words of the Mosbacher family from White Lotus, colonisation is when you come in, kill people, take their land, and then you make them dance. And we can see some of that here as well. So how was the land taken from Palawa? Under terra nullius, Aboriginal people were made to legally disappear. Such declarations, of course, did not make our people actually disappear. That job had to be done by hand. Through war, violence, massacres, martial law, forcible removal and relocation, incarceration, abduction, rape, murder, taking of children, imported diseases, compulsory Christianisation, mistreatment, greed, and duplicity. That's the truth. This here map is taken from the work of Linda Ryan and her colleagues at the University of Newcastle, who are mapping the massacres that happened across Australia. So this is the Tasmania's map as it stands now. To take the land, many atrocities were committed. Now, I doubt whether most of those who started the wars or led the violent excursions or did the massacring actually wanted to do those things. I don't think they were very dissimilar people to us now. So to enable dispossession, it was necessary to dehumanise Palawa. And we can see the echoes of that dehumanisation and consequent willful indifference in attitudes towards Aboriginal people today. So whether genocide was purposeful or a formal goal or not, it very nearly succeeded. The death of Truganina was regarded right up until the 1980s as a closing note, a relegation of the people of Lutruwita to a historical footnote, a doomed people, as we were often referred to in the press and books, as if the tsunami of death that colonisation wrought on my ancestors happened all by itself, a sort of act of nature. So, this is an question for the audience, for the non-Indigenous members of the audience. If colonisation was very nearly successful in wiping out Palawa, where are the traditional country of contemporary Palawa people? Anybody know? Want to tell me? Everywhere? The northeast is right. Okay, so remember I said, go back to the northeast. Contemporary Aboriginal people in Tasmania, Palawa, we all descend from about 10 women, just 10, who survived to have children who don't have children of their own. And nearly all of those women were women who were abducted by sealers from the northeast. So we all owe our lives, well, we owe a lot of things, not all of them good, to the sealers. Now, some of you might be thinking at this stage, but everybody knows what's happened here. There are heaps of books. Indeed, colonisation's rapid decimation of our people has made us a great curiosity to historians. But I challenge the assumption that a heap of books equals a telling of truth. Rather, truth-telling in Tasmania is weighed down by 200 years of silence and the fondness for the comfort such silence provides. From the 1800s, there are books by Bonwick, Calder, Evans, Kelly, Lingroth, Meredith, Backhouse and Walker from West. Then there are those from the 20th century, Corkman, Smith, Travers, Davies, Felton, Westlake, Cameron, Mollison and Everett, Murray Smith, Plomley, Pybus, Ray Ellis, Robson, Clements, Boyce, Ryan, Reynolds and Taylor. And a few others I haven't mentioned. There's plenty of books. I've read most of them. Many of them are dire. Some are pretty good. But only Grease and Ochre is written by a Palawa historian, the wonderful Auntie Patsy Cameron. And very few continue into contemporary times. Also, with a few exceptions, such as Auntie Patsy's History of the Tyree Law Women, most tell just a variation of the same story. About 5 years ago, a PhD student I was supervising mapped a sample of books, of such books written since 1960. Her purpose was to look at who of the 6,000 plus or so Palawa people alive at first colonisation in 1803 featured. The results were telling. The story of colonisation across these books concentrates around just 10 individual Palawa. So the point there is not to disparage the work of the historians. Again, much, not all, is excellent work that endeavours to tell truth. But I want to just demonstrate the limitations and the limited scope of what is known. We know a lot about a little. There's always also a peculiar Tasmanian response, might be in other places, but I've noticed it here, to each news book. So media stories, radio interviews are given with a sort of wide-eyed gormlessness, as if what is written has never been heard before. It's a surprise. And any attempt to discuss the larger story of this island's history quickly sinks into the Tasmanian-shaped void of silence. But the lingering untelling of truth in Lutruwita has large-scale corrosive effects on all of us. As Patrick Wolfe so eloquently put it, colonisation is a structure, not an event. It's not part of history, it's a part of now. And we are all the inheritors of that colonial-based structure. None of us, neither Aboriginal nor non-Aboriginal, have chosen that. It's what we were born into. But we do have a choice about what we do about it. Do we shrug and say, well, what's the point of breaking it all up again, and hope that if we shut down discussion, the truth will go away? Spoiler alert, it won't. Or do we, and this one gets my vote, reckon with our shared past as a very necessary precursor to a different future? Now, saying the truth of what happened in Lutruwita is largely untold is not the same as saying the truth is either unknown or unknowable. It is there in the archives, here and elsewhere, in the reports of colonial authorities, in the ordinary records of day-to-day operations of the colony, church records, settlers' personal accounts. There is, of course, no written record from Palawa, but again, that does not mean the truth is not known. History is personal in Lutruwita. And as shown in Rachel Perkins' recent documentary of the Australian Wars, Palawa families hold many stories which are passed from generation to generation. My own family, the Briggs, hold such a story. I don't have time to give the true honour to the life story of our apical ancestor, Uluṟu, who, like most, was abducted by a sealer. The children she bore grew up in colonists' homes, and these were dangerous placements. There's a written account of her daughter Dalrymple, our ancestor, being chased by a drunk, rifle-carrying Mount Garrett, the colony surgeon, who shot her, not fatally, fortunately, as she climbed a tree to escape him. For Uluṟu herself, her enslavement saw her sold from one sealer to another, marooned in Mauritius for over a year, imprisoned in Waibelina for 12 years before being released, finally, into the care of her daughter Dalrymple. So Uluṟu's story is not a one-off. Other Palawa families have similar stories of their own matriarchs. But what it does do is tell a largely untold section of truths of the abduction, rape, enslavement, and frequent murder of women and the systematic taking of their children, most of whom died young, far away from parents and family. And history is personal in Lutruwita for non-Palawa also. The families who were granted or bought Palawa lands are largely still there. Those families also have stories that have passed through generations, stories that need to be told. As historian Nick Clements revealed, in the Australian Wars episode. His family, and probably most Tasmanian families who have ancestry back to colonial times, were personally involved. They had a stake in the violent war of dispossession. And of course, the impact of colonisation did not end with Truganini. My great-grandmother, Dalrymple Gower, was born in the 1870s, before the death of Truganini in 1876, and her disinterment by the Royal Society 2 years later. Her daughter, my grandmother Gladys Anderson, was born in 1899, just before Truganini's bones were reassembled for public display at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. My father, Cecil Smith, born in 1931, was part of the Palawa struggle to have Truganini's remains returned. They, as did all other Palawa survivors, were systematically shamed for their heritage while also having their existence officially denied. The racism, the discrimination, the impoverisation, and the willful indifference continued underneath the official silence. Now, at this stage, some of you might be starting to get comfortable and thinking, okay, yeah, right, probably is time we had a reckoning with the past. Let me discombobulate you. Tasmania may no longer be a colony, but the colonial past informs and shapes the social and cultural relations of the present. There is still a lot of truth to tell. These are the statements from anthropologists in the arguments as to why Truganini's bones should be not released to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community in 1976. So, the Uluṟu Statement is very clear in making the connection of the past of colonisation with the present dire circumstances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The statement says, proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them, and our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. So, how does these play out in Lutruwita? The Closing the Gap Information Repository from 2022 reveals, as you see here, over-incarceration in Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system, 5 times more likely if you're a Tasmanian Aboriginal man to be imprisoned than if you're a non-Aboriginal Tasmanian. For Aboriginal women, it is 10 times. Not surprisingly, if you lock up mothers, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the child protection system is increasing, and it is 5 times the rate of non-Aboriginal children. Similarly, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal youth in detention is increasing. In 2020 and 2021, Aboriginal young people were more than 5 times as likely to be in detention as non-Aboriginal Tasmanians on an average day. Unfortunately, that is an average day. And these patterns are not only long-standing, but they're worsening. Tellingly, they are very similar across every state in Australia. And more than that, they're similar across all Anglo-settler colonised nation states. In Canada, Indigenous people make up 4% of the population, but a quarter of those incarcerated. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori make up 17% of the population, but 50% of those in jail. In Alaska, Native peoples are 37% of those in prison, but less than 15% of the population. In North Dakota, Native Americans make up 10% of the population, but 30% of those in prison. So how do we explain why being Indigenous in an Anglo-settler colonised country today is directly correlated to the likelihood of incarceration? It's a social pattern. You cannot explain it by individual circumstances. So my argument here is simple. Either the poor old British just happened to colonise the lands of 4 geographically, culturally distinct peoples who were all naturally criminally inclined, or the social structure of Anglo-settler colonised states are causally linked to higher rates of Indigenous incarceration. So truth-telling in Lutruwita cannot and must not be just about the past. And I want to emphasise here, again, it is telling that I feel I have to say this, but I don't think any Tasmanians want to see what is represented in these data of colonisation to continue. But wanting improvement is not resulting in improvement. Why? This is the question that must be asked and truthfully answered. And these are not just statistics. These numbers reflect the dreadful price being paid by real people, their families and their communities. Many more lives, Palawa lives, are being torn asunder, not less. And look, when you look at that rate of children being taken into care, 5 times the rate, that's 50 years more of this misery. It has to stop. So the ramifications for Tasmania's future, not just Palawa's future, are truly frightening. Now, there have been snippets of truth-telling in Lutruwita, such as the formal apology from the university, from which I was proud to say I had a part, or the later apology by the Royal Society and the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. There are also report completed by Professors Warner and McCormack in 2021, which recommends a Truth-Telling Commission as its first recommendation. But these hardly scratch the surface of what needs to be done. So what would truth-telling in Lutruwita look like? Here I draw on my 18 months as a Commissioner with the Yoorrook Justice Commission. So Yoorrook is the first truth-telling body in Australia, and we were established in May 2021 at the request of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria with the permission of the state. Our mandate is to establish the truth of the systemic injustices experienced by First Peoples since 1788 in Victoria. Just a little thing to do. Yoorrook is fully independent of both the First Peoples Assembly and the state government, as it must be. Politics, black or white, cannot be allowed to influence truth-telling. So Yoorrook is a Royal Commission, which means that we have instructions set out in letters patent. All right, I didn't know that before I became a Commissioner. Now I do. So it's framed around 7 objectives, and I've left these there in full, even though that's a lot of words, because the construction of each objective is purposeful. So they are to establish an official public record of First Peoples' experience of systemic injustice, to develop a shared understanding among all Victorians of the impact of that systemic injustice and the intergenerational trauma that has flowed from that, to determine the causes and consequences. So we're not just to map it, we're actually to determine the causes and consequences of systemic injustice, including the role of state policies and laws and state and non-state entities which have responsibility. We're also to develop a shared understanding of all Victorians of the diversity, strength and resilience of First Peoples' cultures, knowledges and practices. We've got to help build the foundations for a new relationship between First Peoples and the state of Victoria and all Victorians. And we've got to support the treaty-making process, which is happening at the same time. And finally, we have to identify systemic injustices which currently impedes First People achieving self-determination and equality, and make recommendations to address them, improve state accountability, and prevent the continuation of recurrence of systemic injustice. So these objectives, you'll be lucky I didn't put up all the terms of reference. Again, they're overwhelming, but they're summarised there, which they instruct us that we have to inquire into historical and ongoing systemic injustices. So we're now heavily into the business end of this remit, with a current focus on child protection and the criminal justice system. So submissions have been open on these topics since mid-October, and we go to our first of 3 sets of formal hearings on the 6th of December. We've got more hearings in February and another set again in March. And we're due to make another second interim report in June 2023. Why did we choose criminal justice and child protection? Because they were the priorities that elders told us to follow as our priority, as our first inquiry when we did our extensive on-country consultations in March and April this year. We couldn't get out last year because of COVID lockdowns. And we had a first set of public hearings in April, May that also drew on those. So the question is, can the Yoorrook framework be translated to Tasmania? And the answer is yes, but with Lutruwita shaped caveats. So Victoria is in the centre of the Aboriginal Renaissance in Australia. So over the last 15 years, but mostly in the last 6 or 7, the Victorian state and First Peoples have developed a treaty and truth-linked infrastructure. There is also a long existing public service infrastructure that also influences. So as you can see, this timeline I put together, you've got 2006, you've got the Aboriginal Heritage Act. Now, there's lots of bits in between as well, but that act is particularly important because what it does, it allows for groups of traditional owners to be registered as registered Aboriginal parties. That gives them traditional owner status, and it gives them rights and where they must be consulted about things happening on their own country. There are 11 registered Aboriginal parties to date. So it's a very formal process. Then in 2016, we've got an Aboriginal Treaty Working Group being set up. And in the blue down below, I'll draw your attention here. So this is what exists there in Victoria, that you've got Aboriginal Deputy Secretaries across all departments. You've got the Aboriginal Justice Caucus. You've got the Aboriginal Wellbeing Strategic Plan. You've got I can't read one over there, I have to turn around. The Aboriginal Youth Justice Strategy, the Victorian Aboriginal Affairs Framework. So you can see there is a huge amount of work that has been undertaken, and Aboriginal self-determination and looking for the ending of systemic injustice is built right across the public service. Then you've got in 2017, you've got the establishment of the Office of the Victorian Treaty Advancement Commissioner. And Jill Gallagher AO, who's one of my heroes, was appointed the Commissioner in the 1st of January in 2018. Now, what that Treaty Advancement Commission role did was that they actually established the foundation of how to get the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria elected Parliament. So First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is a group of, well, I'll go on to a little bit more, I'll talk about what Jill Gallagher did. So as the Commissioner, she not only worked through how you could actually do that, and it's never been done in Australia before, but she led the community consultations and negotiations to bring everybody together, to work together, to put aside the various different fights between people over different bits of land, to all work for a common purpose. She was successful. The state then did its part with the advancing the treaty process with Aboriginal Victorians Act. So this legislation, that's it here, and you can go online and get a copy of that, sets out the legal framework for the establishing an Aboriginal representative body, the guiding principles for the treaty process, and the establishment of a treaty authority to arbitrate the treaty making process. 2019, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria were elected, 31 elected members across 5 regions with 11 seats reserved for those formally recognised traditional owner groups. Now, the First Peoples Assembly is led by 2 co-chairs, 1 male, 1 female, and a 9-person board. They also oversee a self-determination fund, which funds First Peoples' needs, what they need to actually be able to have a level playing field to negotiate treaty. 2021, the Yoorrook Justice Commission is set up by agreement between the First Peoples Assembly and the state, and the 5 commissioners were appointed with an open application process. There were 64 applications, and the First Peoples Assembly and the state made the selections. In 2022, it's just come out, and I'll show you it again if you want to have a look for it. This is the Treaty Negotiation Framework. And what that does, it is an established agreement between the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and the State of Victoria, which sets out how treaty making can proceed and including the role of the Treaty Authority. I also point out that all of these in recent years have had bipartisan support in the Victorian Parliament. Now, the problem here in Lutruwita is that we have none of this, absolutely none. There's no Office of the Treaty Advancement Commissioner, no senior public service roles, or maybe one or two, not across all the departments that count. No caucuses, no accountabilities, no agreed frameworks, no legislation, no First Peoples Assembly, and most certainly no Truth-Telling Commission. Yes, the state has made some moves with a working group with members drawn from community groups with the stated aim of a code designing processes. But the idea of a code design process does not fill me with any confidence that we are heading in a viable direction. Code design is a buzzword, often used without any clarity of what it actually means. Governments love it, and in my experience, when it's used by the state around Aboriginal matters, it usually means that we're an advisory group and the state keeps control. Drawing members from organisations also fills me with trepidation. Organisations have competing vested interests. And if you look at this is a treaty negotiation framework. This is the treaty advancement legislation. These are serious, heavy-duty legal documents. A working party does not have the skill set or the infrastructure to be able to achieve these. And that's what we need. We need to do it properly. Now, I haven't seen what the working group is going to do. But it does seem that so far what we have in Tasmania is just the minimum possible. And I remain very concerned about the success of treaty, truth or voice here. And I'm not just critiquing the state. There's enough critique to go around. We Palawa also need to shoulder responsibility to stop already with allowing division to be stoked between us. We need to come together for shared purpose, for a different future. And we are out of time. The politics have caught up. All other states are further along their journey towards truth, voice and treaty. And the federal government has committed to enacting the Uluṟu Statement, and the work on voice is underway with a referendum likely very soon. Let's not be the laggards. Actually, in fact, we already are the laggards. Let's catch up and let's do it better. So if we're going to do it, let's do it competently and let's do it formally. I, and I imagine most Palawa, will not accept a half-baked process. Now, a formal approach requires Palawa leadership and a bespoke infrastructure. And while the topic tonight is truth-telling, for no one part of truth, voice and treaty is standalone. A viable process must integrate thinking and processes in all three elements. So this is what I think we need. I think we first need to establish a Palawa-framed and led prerequisite infrastructure to get to this level of work. We need to set up the Victorian Office of the Treaty Advancement Commission is a good adaptable model with a successful track record. It was independent, had integrity, was Aboriginal-led, worked with the state, but didn't do the work of the state. We need to set up a Commissioner's Truth, Treaty, Voice and Support Office. So the office's role is to do the collaborative high-level planning and design of the prerequisite legal instruments to enable truth treaty to be delivered. The office must be Palawa-led. It's not the role of the state, although work would work with the state. The office would also have the role of bringing Palawa together, building trust and cooperation and dedication to a shared purpose. We need to develop formal pathways for traditional owner groups to form and exercise their rights over their country. Again, the Victorian model is not flaw-free. But it has been for operation for 15 years, and there are 11 registered Aboriginal parties and more coming online. It's more complicated here because of the near genocide. but it's still eminently doable. And traditional owner means you have a verifiable link to a particular country through descent from your apical ancestor. It is not where your organisation is located. We've got to develop the terms of reference for a truth-telling commission. These need to be broad enough to allow full telling of truth of Lutruwita, 1788 to the present, because we know from the stories of, from our own histories, the sealers were here in 1797, 5-6 years before the first bit of colonisation. Again, the remit is probably large, but it needs to be. Halfway measures won't do. The state needs to deliver enabling legislation for treaty, truth and voice. It needs to be done in concert with Palawa, and especially the officer of the Commission to enact this enabling legislation. Then we need to establish a legally empowered truth-telling commission. Now, it has to have, a Royal Commission has powers of compulsion. It can hold the state to account and other bodies to account. That's what we have to have here. So I don't know whether the Royal Commission is the best model. I think it probably is, but anything less will not be accepted. Palawa are always already very, very suspicious about inquiries and reports. And the broader Tasmanian population will not have confidence in the truths emerging unless they can see and understand the establishment of the evidence of those truths. And that's what a Royal Commission does. Something less is a waste of everybody's time. And truth-telling and the treaty need to run in tandem. Treaty is primarily between Palawa and the state, and this relationship will be inherently political and at times conflictual and confrontational. Treaty processes therefore need to be independent of truth-telling and vice versa, so that negotiations for treaty can be pursued rigorously without compromising the truth-telling processes or its outcomes or its findings. So these truth-telling and treaty should and can and should co-occur. Truth-telling processes provide the evidence to establish the truth and the pathway to justice from the truth. The treaty process is primarily the vehicle for obtaining that justice. And I can't stress this enough, all aspects must be Palawa-led and governed. So finally, to conclude, the Uluṟu Statement from the Heart calls for a fair and truthful relationship and a better future for our children based on self-determination and justice. And make no mistake, the consequences of whether we as a state have the courage to begin the necessary formal public reckoning with the truth of colonisation, or whether we as a state grab for the comforter of continued silence will impact all, with the costs not just borne by Palawa. So let's get truth-telling. It's only then I think that this island, Lutruwita, will truly be home for all of us. Walika.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And if you'd like to come and take a seat in the firing line. So the first question that we have online goes to a point, Maggie, that you made a little earlier on, where you offered a critical reflection on the concept of co-design. The question is, how can you get to self-determination with co-design?
You can't. It's very simple. Co-design, I don't know what it means, and people who know me will know that I have a visceral hatred of the term and its use. But co-design, I don't know what co-design means, and it's certainly you cannot be self-determining with co-design.
A question from the audience in the middle here. Thank you. And just a reminder, the usual protocols, please keep your contributions to questions rather than statements, and we'll take questions that are on topic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I've been retired for 20 years as a former teacher, 38 years in service here and in Canada, and a high school principal. But I've been appalled at the decline in the clarity of school curriculum over many of those years, especially over the last 30 years or so, and the failure for departments of education or others, maybe from the university and part of the failure too, to provide adequate materials for teachers who simply do not have the time to prepare anything even as good as Out of the Mist by Williams, the textbook for social studies in the late 40s and 50s. People might remember that if they're old enough to remember it. What I'd like to know, and I know this is maybe jumping too far ahead of the more essential aspects of truth-telling to the adult population, but has there been any effort put into research and preparation of good textbooks, curriculum materials of a wide range to be disseminated into schools to ensure that the new generation coming on will have an adequate education, and far superior to that I experienced? My early knowledge of Aboriginal life in Tasmania and Australia was simply dependent upon the sanitarium. And if you're old enough, you might remember the sanitarium cards we got out of sanitarium wheat bixes and granoses and so on. And we got show bags at the show in the 1950s, and we pasted these in, and it gave a rather strange history of Aboriginal life and culture. I've still got it. But until recent years, in retirement, I had the time. I've been reading a lot of things. Patsy Cameron's book was one that really impressed me and got me thinking as to maybe having a grandmother who was a Briggs. But Greg Lehman, I think in a letter to me, Ross Butler, I am Greg, you wrote to me earlier this year after I wrote to you. And I'm not sure that we are of that Briggs descent. I'd be fascinated to do some more work on that. But back to the point of my question, has there been much research done on school curriculum or even thinking given to what I believe is probably the most important element of the truth-telling?
Thank you, Ross. Have we progressed beyond sanitarium cards?
We have, and I suggest you burn them. Look, it's there is work and good work being done in the Tasmanian Education Department. I've talked about the orb and other things. However, I don't think it gets through to schools properly. However, I can't really comment on that. I don't have any research of what is being taught in schools, but I do know from the school groups that we've had through during my time here at the university, there was a pretty big gap in knowledge about Aboriginal Tasmania.
Yes, appalling so.
We'll go to, thank you, Maggie. We'll go to an online question, a brief and pointed question. Why has Tasmania fallen behind the other states and territories? Is there something different about this state?
I think the truth here is so horrible that there is an even greater reluctance to address it. And I think we have become, over those years, we have become so comfortable with the silence, and there is always the idea that somehow things will just get kicked. Yes, we'll do it, but we'll just keep kicking it along the road, kicking the can along the road, because the actual courage to start isn't there. I hope it's here now, but I think that there is an even greater reluctance in Tasmania to actually start the process.
Question from the audience.
Hi, Maggie. I'm Trenton, a sociology student. So when I heard you were here tonight, I fangirled a bit. My question is, like you were saying about kicking the can down the road, how can white people as allies, what can we do so we're not just kicking the can down the road, so we can have what you presented tonight and how we can help the native people of this land?
Well, truth-telling is not just for Palawa, it's for all Tasmanians, and all Tasmanians have to demand it. So we can't move forward until we tell the truth. Until we do treaty, then we can. So let's get on with it, and everybody back it. Everybody jump up and down if we don't get what we need.
Hello, my name's Terrell Riley Gibson. I'm very fortunate to be doing some postgraduate research on Dalrymple Margaret Briggs. I'm very excited about that. My question is that you mentioned that the the Victorian model could be used in Tasmania, but there would need to be some caveats. I'm interested for you to tell us what those caveats might be.
Mostly that we have to get the infrastructure in place because we've been so busy denying the truth in Tasmania, so busy denying the need for truth and for treaty, and for really not getting the work done that other states, especially Victoria, but other states have done in the last 20 and 30 years. We can't wait 20 or 30 years to catch up. So we have to do things very quickly, and we have to put infrastructure together very quickly. There's no reason why we can't, but we have to get it together very soon and not try and jump over the steps that other states have taken, because that's just a recipe for disaster and for failure.
Well, thank you, Terrell. We'll go to an online, quite a long question, but there's a compliment in there, so I'll read it out in full. From David Gutteridge, he gave his name, so I'll introduce him personally. I completed your wonderful Indigenous Life Worlds unit at UTAS this semester. So firstly, a huge thank you for this. I wonder if this unit should be a compulsory part of any degree at UTAS and maybe any type of higher education or vocational education. Do you think that educating non-Palawa people on this history is key? And can we honestly get to the truth until the whole history is known and accepted?
Thank you, David. I'd love to make it compulsory, but unfortunately that wouldn't work. People need to want to hear the truth. And I would recommend anybody who does want to do the Palawa Life Worlds course to please do it. It will give you an entree into Palawa life, as we really are. I've forgotten the rest of the question now.
Can we honestly get to the truth until the whole history is told and accepted?
No, we can't. And that's why the first objective in the Yoorrook Justice Commission is for the writing of an official record from the Victorian First Peoples perspective of his systemic injustices from 1788 onwards. And that's what we need here too. So the truth needs to be told, and it needs to be formally told.
Thanks, Maggie. Another question in the room?
Graham McLean is my name. Thanks very much for your presentation. Given the importance of the message that you're trying to get across, how would you propose to outcompete the competition you're getting for this message from things like the Mac Point Stadium or the football team or this ridiculous stuff? I mean, we're preaching to the converted here, but there are thousands of unconverted people out in the general community. How do you get the message across to them?
I think we do. There are a lot of people who don't think about it much, and I understand that. But it really is now the time for the state to step up and actually get this underway. So yes, we need pressure from allies, but we can't expect the rest of Tasmania to come along if the state aren't committed. And they have to, and to be committed, as the Vice Chancellor probably remembers, in my time as Vice PVC here, I banned the use of the word committed in any university documents, because you can't sell committed, you can't use commitment. It just, I used to say, please don't tell me you're committed and you take it very seriously. Please use your doing words, do some action words. And I would say that to the state as well. Please don't tell me you're committed. What are you actually going to do?
Just while we're going to another question in the room, this is a related question online. How can non-Aboriginal people best advocate and support truth-telling and treaty?
Start conversations with your friends and family. Talk about truth-telling. Talk about it as a necessary part of who we are in Lutruwita. Don't be afraid to have those sometimes awkward conversations with family and friends. And they can be awkward because people just aren't used to talking about this. But once we break that silence, we break it forever. So have the courage, talk to people.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Greg. Adele Yusuf from the Tasmanian, I forgot my institution's name, sorry. Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. Thank you, Greg. The gentleman just stole my thunder. Political action needs public advocacy. And so how to better, the gentleman did steal my question, how to better educate people about the need for political action. And if I may, Greg, just one small example, if I may quickly. I was at a high-level meeting. I have a project going that I'm pushing hard. A consultant was, I'm sorry, I didn't mention I'm Palestinian, so colonization is very close to my heart. A consultant suggested an Israeli company come on board, and I stated that that's a line in the sand for me. It's my project, no Israelis. A colleague who is very dear to me, I've stayed at his house, I love him very much. He's my mentor, suggested that I recuse myself from meetings with Israelis. I did not feel that my colleague understood, and that's what we need to do. So how do we obtain, I'm preaching to the converted here again, but the general public, how will they get the message about the dehumanization of the colonization process? Thank you.
Look, this is where truth-telling comes in. As all the Palawa in the room here, we've been working, all of us, for a very, very long time to try and make change in this state with pretty limited success. So it can't be just up to us. And truth-telling is a prerequisite for making that change. So we can't make the change and then have the truth-telling. Truth-telling, formal truth-telling from a royal commission or other similar powerful legal body is a prerequisite for us then to institute those changes. You get treaty, you get justice, you get reparations.
Thank you, Maggie. We'll go to one more online question. And look, thank you, participants online. There are many excellent questions there, and unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all. But perhaps just to flip to the other side of the coin, there's a question here from Michelle Welsh. How can Palawa overcome differences within community to be able to come together and work together to progress a Truth and Treaty Commission in Tasmania?
I don't have a recipe for overcoming the divisions, often many, many years in the making, but I think we have no choice but to actually come together and collaborate. And I think most of us are aware of that. We know that. The adults in the room know that. We have to get together. We can still hate each other on our own time, but when we're working for truth and treaty and voice, we have to work together.
And we'll finish off with one more question from the audience.
And also that's what's happened in Victoria. You know, there's lots of political issues and people have fights in Victoria as well, but they get together for that common purpose.
Thank you very much. I'm Perry Davidson. I've recently moved from Victoria. There's 6.5 million people in Victoria and 500,000 here. And you talked about the state needs to be committed, but we are the state. I mean, the state represents us. So it's sort of like the chicken and the egg, really, isn't it? You know, who's going to start talking? A few weeks ago, I went to Bothwell for the weekend, and it was the 200-year bicentennial of grazier. There were so many opportunities for someone to actually acknowledge that this wasn't the original land of the smartly dressed graziers, who are all very lovely, I'm sure, but there was just so many opportunities for that, that truth telling, but not one word for the whole weekend. So I don't know, it's a rhetorical question.
That's that very comfortable silence. And that's what we have to crack open.
Unfortunately, as always happens at events like this, time has beaten us. Again, thank you very much for the many excellent questions from the floor here tonight, and online. Would you please join me in thanking our speaker tonight, Professor Maggie Walter. This talk will be available soon as video and podcast, and you can find these and upcoming events on the Island of Ideas website. Just search Island of Ideas UTAS, and the link is on the screen. The next event will be Dr. Matthew Eves delivering the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture, Are the Paris Climate Goals Still Attainable? On Thursday, the 24th of November this year. And that will be available online or here in the Stanley Burbury Lecture Theatre. Tune in to find out more about his work with Oxford that gives hope for global sustainability and the prospect of future green economic prosperity. Again, thank you all very much for participating in this special event. On behalf of the University of Tasmania, have a happy and safe evening. Good night.